All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to do something kind of crazy. Cram 2,000 years of American history into one short explainer. And we're not starting in 1776. Nope. Our story begins way, way before that, on a continent that was anything but new. So let's just dive right in.
You know, we often think the story of America starts with Columbus, right? Well, this quote right here flips that whole idea on its head. It argues that for the millions of people already living here, this wasn't a beginning. It was a cataclysmic interruption. And just thinking about it that way, man, it changes everything. It reframes the entire story we're about to tell.
So let's talk about that story before the interruption. Before 1492, this land wasn't empty. It was this incredible tapestry of vast and really complex civilizations.
This really gets to the heart of a huge myth. The whole idea of a new world just waiting to be discovered. It's just not true. This wasn't some vast, untouched wilderness. It was a world that was already ancient, already vibrant, and home to millions of people living in some seriously developed societies.
And just look at this. We're talking about incredible sophistication. I mean, you've got the ancestral Puebloans in the Southwest building these massive stone cities that were basically astronomical observatories. Then, out in the Midwest, you have the city of Cahokia, which, get this, was bigger than London was at the same time. And up in the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee had this political confederacy, a real democracy with a constitution that even guys like Benjamin Franklin took notes from. Just amazing.
So when the two worlds met, it kicked off something we now call the Columbian Exchange. It was this massive transfer of plants, animals, technology, but the most consequential thing, by far, was disease. The indigenous peoples had no immunity to European diseases like smallpox. The result was absolutely catastrophic. We're talking mortality rates as high as 95% in some areas. It's a number that's hard to even wrap your head around, and it completely changed the future of the continent.
Okay, so out of this collision of worlds, a brand new nation starts to take shape, and it's founded on these incredibly radical, forward-thinking ideals. But, and this is a huge but, it was also born with this massive contradiction baked right in from the start.
So how do you go from being loyal subjects of the king to full-blown revolutionaries? Well, it happened faster than you might think. For a long time, the colonies were kind of left to do their own thing. But then Britain decided to tighten the reins, especially with new taxes. That lit a fuse. You get the cry of no taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, and then these intolerable acts, and boom. Before you know it, shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, and there's no turning back.
And just a year later, in 1776, they make it official with the Declaration of Independence. And these words, they are absolutely electrifying. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This wasn't just a "we're breaking up with you" letter to King George. This was a declaration for the whole world. It was a radical idea about human rights and the right of people to govern themselves. It became the bedrock, the very creed of this new nation.
But, and here it is, that massive contradiction we talked about, what did all men are created equal actually mean? I mean, really mean. Because in 1776, 1 out of every 5 people in America was enslaved. How do you square that circle? An empire of liberty built on a foundation of slavery. This wasn't a small problem. It was the central, haunting paradox of the nation's founding.
So their first shot at a government, the Articles of Confederation, was, well, it was really weak. And that was on purpose. They were terrified of creating another powerful king. But it turned out to be too weak. The government couldn't even raise taxes or an army. When a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts rebelled, that was Shays' Rebellion, the government was basically powerless to stop it. It was a huge wake-up call. They realized they needed something stronger, which led them back to the drawing board to create the Constitution we have today. And that central problem, the issue of slavery, it didn't just disappear. In fact, it got worse. As the country started pushing westward, every single new piece of land sparked the same explosive fight. Would it be a free state or a slave state? This question just kept getting louder and more violent until it literally ripped the nation in two.
Fueling all this westward expansion was this really powerful idea called manifest destiny. It was this belief, and a lot of people held it very deeply, that the United States was basically destined by God to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This idea was used to justify things like the Mexican-American War, which brought in a ton of new land. But you see the pattern here, right? More land meant the same old fight over slavery, and each time it just pushed the country one step closer to all-out war.
And eventually, all the compromises, all the political deals, they failed. The argument finally exploded into the Civil War, and the cost was just staggering. More than 620,000 Americans died, more than in any other war in the nation's history. It was a brutal, bloody conflict that came down to answering two massive questions. Would the United States remain one country, and would slavery finally be abolished?
The time right after the war, called Reconstruction, was this brief, shining moment of incredible hope and progress. You have 3 new amendments to the Constitution that end slavery and grant citizenship and voting rights to black men. You see black Americans voting and holding political office for the first time. It was a revolution. But it was met with a horrifyingly violent backlash. And then, a shady political deal in 1877 pulled federal troops out of the South. And just like that, the whole thing collapsed. The promise of Reconstruction was broken, and it would be almost another 100 years before it was taken up again.
All right, so in the aftermath of the Civil War, America starts to change, and I mean really change. It goes from being this torn apart, mostly agricultural country into a powerhouse, an industrial giant. And this new power would eventually pull it, maybe a little reluctantly at first, onto the global stage.
This next period is called the Gilded Age, and that name is perfect. Gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold. It looked shiny and prosperous on the outside, but underneath, not so much. You had so-called robber barons like Carnegie and Rockefeller making unimaginable fortunes, but at the same time, millions of factory workers and new immigrants were living in just grinding poverty. So yeah, tons of wealth was created, but it also created huge social problems that led to a massive cry for change. That whole cycle of boom-bust and calls for reform really came to a head with the Great Depression. It was an economic disaster, and the response, FDR's New Deal, was more than just a quick fix. It completely changed the game. It fundamentally redefined what the government's role in people's lives should be. And look at the programs it created. FDIC insurance on our bank accounts, Social Security. These aren't just history. They are pillars of American society right now, today.
Now, the New Deal definitely softened the blow of the Depression, but what really, truly ended it was World War II. The sheer scale of industrial production needed for the war effort kicked the economy into overdrive. The war also completely shattered America's long-held tradition of staying out of world affairs. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. became the arsenal of democracy, and by the time the dust settled in 1945, there was no question America was the new global superpower.
But there was no time to rest. The end of World War II almost immediately led to the start of a brand new global conflict, the Cold War. This decades-long standoff with the Soviet Union would define everything, not just foreign policy, but huge social movements right here at home. So what was the game plan for the Cold War? It all boiled down to one word: containment. The idea was simple. Don't let Soviet communism spread. Stop it wherever it tries to expand. And this one strategy drove everything. It's why NATO was created. It's why we had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And it's why the US got involved in incredibly costly and divisive wars in Korea and Vietnam. Now here's something really interesting. The Cold War put America in a really awkward spot. It was going around the world talking about freedom and democracy, while back home it was denying basic rights to its black citizens. The hypocrisy was glaring. And the civil rights movement put that hypocrisy on the world stage for everyone to see. Through nonviolent protest and just unbelievable bravery, activists forced the country to finally live up to its own ideals, passing laws that, at long last, started to make good on the broken promises of Reconstruction. Fast forward to the 1980s, and that policy of containment, it seemed to be working. The Soviet system was rotting from the inside out. And then, in 1989, we get this incredible, joyous moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was the perfect symbol for the end of an era. Just a couple of years later, the Soviet Union itself was gone. The Cold War was over, and America was left standing as the world's only superpower. And that brings us more or less to today, into the 21st century. And as always, there are new challenges. This time they're being driven by a technological revolution that's connecting us in some ways, but also testing the very idea of national unity like never before. I mean, think about it. The internet, social media, it's connected the whole planet. But it's also had this other, much darker effect. It's fueled this incredible division. This chart says it all. The gap between the political left and right has just exploded. We all get trapped in our own little social media bubbles, our own echo chambers, where our own beliefs just get repeated back to us.
It's gotten to the point where it feels like we're not even living in the same country anymore.
So when you look back at all of this, you realize the American story isn't some neat, tidy book with a final chapter. It's more like a continuous, messy, and often really loud argument. An argument about what those words from 1776 actually mean. What is liberty? What is equality? From the great cities of Cahokia to the deeply divided digital world we live in now, that big project of trying to form a more perfect union is still going on. And it's still, as it has always been, completely unfinished.